Anita Ihuman, and today I'll be speaking on the topic evaluating usability in technical documentation. So I'm going to give a quick example of why I picked this topic. About this time last year, I was opportunity to speak at Sustained Open Source Community Africa Sustained Meetup Group. And in that section, I asked an entire hall of developers and open source contributors how frequently they use open source, how frequently they actually read through documentation, or how much time they actually spend on documentation. To my greatest surprise, very few persons were able to indicate that they read documentations for more than 5 minutes. And this is because a lot of persons say they only read documentation when they need to solve a particular problem, or when they see that there are no videos on YouTube to explain that project. That's when they read documentation. Now, whereas that's not the purpose of the documentation serves as an onboarding tool or as an explanation of what the project does and how you can achieve the goal that you're working towards, right? And so that's why, that's what brought me to this topic, the usability of your technical documentation. And a little bit about me. I am Anita Ihuman, like I said, I'm a developer advocate, previously at Nemata and API 7. I'm also a technical writer and an open source advocate. So if you don't see me, when you catch me off normal project, I'm contributing to open source communities like the Good Docs projects, Chaos Community, Layer 5, and so many others. So that's all about me. So let's get into the topic. During this section, we're going to discuss what exactly usability evaluation is all about, the characteristics of a usable document, the factors that influence your documentation's usability, and how to evaluate a technical documentation, and then your role as a technical writer in your usability evaluation and why you should evaluate your documentation's usability in the first place. So let's get into it. Now, when you go through a documentation, there are often different contents or different documents that exist there, not just one. You could have the release notes, you could have your handbook, you could have your API documentation, insurance policies, manuals, and all of that. And of course, with all of this numerous documentation, the reader at the end of the day might just glance through one of these documents that exists in your project based on the needs that they're trying to meet or the specific solution to the problems that they're facing. And so oftentimes people don't read through the entire documentation that you might have for a particular project. Now they would rather go through the YouTube channels. Like I said earlier, most persons would rather go through YouTube channels or read articles that exist on this, or even go to Stack Overflow. And that's a common thing. However, how do you know that your documentation is usable enough for people to actually read this content, or read the content, retain the knowledge, and then use it for the problems that they're trying to solve? Well, this is simply a way of, you can create a usable document by simply ensuring that the various users that come to your website, or the various users that open your documentation can learn, can understand, and utilize the knowledge they've acquired from this documentation to solve their specific objectives. And that is basically what it means for your documentation to be usable, for the user to maximize the benefits of that documentation to attend to their problems or to fix the specific challenges that they might be encountering. Now, you can determine that your documentation is usable by carrying out a few evaluations. And what exactly is an usability evaluation? This is simply a measure to determine how efficient and satisfactory your documentation is to the user's needs and demands. So that's basically what the usability evaluation we'll be talking about during this section is all about. Now, you have to go through a few tests, and it depends on what it is and the target audience that you're looking out for. We're going to mention some few tests during the course of this section, and we'll discuss it much later. Well, in order for your documentation to be considered usable, there are a few characteristics that your documentation actually has to possess. And some of these characteristics include, it should be easy to learn, first and foremost. your documentation, regardless of the project, regardless of the technology that you're writing this documentation for, it should be easy to understand. I remember some time back, someone said most technical documentations or most technologies, especially cloud native technologies, documentations are really, really scary to read through. And I asked why, and the response was they use a lot of technical terminologies that a beginner might not have a vast understanding of, or for somebody who is new into the technology, they might need to like do extra Googling to understand what the documentation is saying. And which is true, because I also went through the same learning curve. But in order for your documentation to be considered usable, it should actually be easy to learn. It should be easy for me to successfully complete a task that I'm working on without having to go through extra learning curves for me to understand what your documentation is all about. Another characteristic is it should be engaging. So if I come to your documentation, I should be able to do more than just solve that specific problem that I'm coming for. I should be able to see other things that could lead me to finding more answers or more knowledge about your documents that I probably don't know about. And another characteristic you should look out for is the effectiveness of your document. Does it actually serve the purpose that it is created for? For instance, you have a how-to documentation. Does it actually do the work of a how-to documentation? Or you have a landing page, for instance, or a homepage. Does your homepage actually fulfill the responsibilities of a homepage? Does it lead the users or the readers to the right places? And does it have all of its structures laid out in a way that I could actually get around with this? And then your documentation should also be effective. And by effective, I mean, how fast can I actually solve my problem once I come across your documents? Now, most times you notice that people don't really spend so much time on documents. They spend at least 10 to 15 minutes or at max 10 to glance through, and then once they find the solutions they're looking for, they're off. And so your documentation should be able to render the solutions within that short time of 5 to 10 minutes that a user actually comes across that particular documentation, and provide the entire knowledge that I need to actually understand what your product or your technology is talking about. And then another characteristic is it should be efficient. It should be efficient in the sense that I should be able to accomplish my tasks to the maximum. And with the first encounter, even if it's my first encounter with your documentation, I should be able to actually accomplish the goal and the objective that made me find this documentation in the first place. And it should also be error tolerant, in the sense that if I happen to, if I'm trying to install if I'm trying to install your software, or I'm trying to integrate your product into my project, does your documentation also highlight possible errors that I could encounter? And if it highlights it, does it also draw my attention to solutions that I can use if I come across certain errors? And this could include your FAQs having all of the necessary knowledge I need, or your help guide that also provides the necessary things I need to take note of. So all of this are things that you should take into note to consider your documentation usable. And finally, it should be satisfactory. Now, as a user coming into a documentation for the first time, now I wouldn't bother so much to know how much effort you made towards creating that document. The only thing that I'll be concerned about as a user is to know if that documentation is going to solve my problem. And if it does solve my problem, then I'll be pleased with the experience, and I can always refer this document onto the next person, saying you don't need to read all of the YouTube videos or read all of the articles and watch so much YouTube videos. The documentation does all of that. And I noticed some companies can be really confident when they speak about the documentation, because it is that good. And until your documentation has majority of all of these ticked, it can barely be considered usable. And since evaluating the usability of a technical documentation is a vital part of creating the documentation itself, there are some factors that you should also take into consideration in order to determine that your documentation is 100% usable to your audience and your target market. And some of these include readability, the accessibility, the content quality, the intuitive design that you have created, the language diversity and inclusion for that particular documentation, the visual and the graphical content. Now we're going to get into each of these and break them down. So for readability, first and foremost, you should, this factor focuses on making sure that your documentation is readable and ensures that it can be comprehended easily, both by visually and visually or cognitively members or readers that are accessing your documentation. So take, for instance, like I said earlier, I have no idea of your technology, but I'm just getting started in that particular field, and I come across your documentation. I should be able to get an understanding of that technology or the prerequisite knowledge that I need in order to adopt that technology should be highlighted on the web page, just for the sake of users that are new to the technology. They can always refer back to the prerequisite before coming to read further in the documentation, right? So your document should actually be able to relay this information in the most simple and understandable ways possible. And oftentimes people leave the role of documentation in the hands of developers, whereas this is a really tricky thing, because the developer might have like a more concise understanding of the project. However, the developer might not be able to convey the knowledge or the content into a more understandable form for the audience. And that's why you need to work, your developers need to work along with a technical writer, experienced technical writers that can help convey this message in the most understandable way possible, and or in the most readable way possible. And so to ensure, you should also ensure that the vocabulary that you're using for your documentation matches the target audience that you're actually looking out for. And that is why the engineering team has to work along with the technical writers to create a better and more readable documentation for your product. Another thing to look out for is the accessibility. Now, an accessible document delivers content through several channels and allows different individuals to actually benefit from the documents itself. And so regardless of what physical and mental challenges that the readers might have, they should also be able to benefit from this challenge. Now we're asking questions like, does the graphics of your documentation allow people who have vision impairment to actually access the document? Or if, for instance, I happen to have a color blindness or something of the sort, is there like a dark mode and light mode I can toggle between for your documentation? And you also look out for things like, does your documentation have text to audio translation? So if I happen to not understand, or if I happen to not be able to see the content, I can actually play the audio and translate it into text for persons who are not able to read the content out. So all of these things are things you should take into consideration to make sure that your document is also accessible to the different diverse users that will be coming to your website. And then another factor that you should look out for is the content quality. Most times we have like documentation with so many pages, 100 to 200 pages, and at the end of the day, the only pages that the users are looking out for is getting started documentation, how to install documentation, and probably the feature documentation. So like they're only focusing on this content, right? So if you're creating a document, you should actually look out for areas that you know that your audience would focus more attention on, and focus on those areas, and then create the content in a way that whatever it is that problems might be, I can easily just identify that particular because the content of your documentation is actually what I am looking for or what I need at that particular time. And so focus more on creating high quality information that will be available to your users or to your readers that access this particular documentation. Another thing is the intuitive design. Your documentation, regardless of what the technology it is that is used, should be able to make my experience easy and faster. And so I don't have to struggle navigating around the document. Let's say, for instance, I'm looking for the FAQ and the FAQ is hidden within the getting started and I can't seem to find the navigations anywhere. All of that are things that could actually make the experience really challenging for most contributors. And so to consider an intuitive design or to create an intuitive design for documentation, you should look out for things like drop downs to help easy navigation, search buttons for easy access. So if I don't have to like scroll through the entire document to find a particular thing, I could just search that specific word and find it immediately. Or you should actually allow browsing through the topics that are available for that. So whichever design or whatever pattern you choose to create your document, you should actually have an intuitive design so that it will make the experience easy for people and faster for people that are accessing it. Another thing to consider is the language diversity and the inclusion. Now, documentations should avoid non-inclusive languages. And by non-inclusive languages, I mean, if regardless of the services that product is rendering, you should also consider that this is going to be on the web and it could actually come up. A lot of users could come across it. And so you should be inclusive with the kind of terms and language that you use. And also, if you're thinking of the language differences, how many languages does this thing support? I know I've come across a couple of projects that have the feature that you can enable to convert the content of the website to another language. And let's say, for instance, I'm just coming in for the first time and it is written completely in China. I can easily just convert it to English for someone who is not, who doesn't speak Chinese. And whatever the language is though, but the idea is let it support different languages that your users could actually just convert it into to save them all of that stress. And then another thing is the visual and the graphical content. Nowadays, the majority of people prefer watching videos, like the example and the instance I gave earlier. We prefer watching videos and reading short articles rather than reading an entire paragraph and pages of documentation. And so having your information relayed in the form of video would help so many users to actually read and practice along while going through a documentation. And also you should consider creating images that explain what's the particular concept in a documentation is saying. And with all of this, you can help users to spend more time interacting with your website, either by watching the videos or trying to understand the pictographs that are available on that particular document, whatever it is that you're using to explain your context to your users. But then consider the visual and the graphical content to make it more interactive as well. And then there are different ways that we can actually evaluate the technical content. Like I said, there's a couple of tests that you need to do to determine how usable your technical documentation is. And some of these tests include, you can actually consider using all of these tests. Now, most companies or most teams do that. You can run through all of the tests to determine that, yes, your documentation is 100% perfect. But you can also just try one or two of these tests, and if it works good enough for you, then you can proceed with your documentation release. But however, using more than one sort of test will provide you with more detailed information about the quality of your documentation and also how you can improve on it. The first test is the focus testing. Now, this is simply a research technique which you can get to assemble a group of persons or individuals in a moderated section, and then they give you feedback on your documentation or a particular documentation that you've showed to them. Now, in the case of focus testing, yeah, oftentimes it's best expected that you meet individuals that are experts in the field, that are familiar with your product that you're trying to improve on the documentation. or even internal members of the team. Now I'm going to give an example again, which is the Good Docs project where I contribute to. Now at the Good Docs project, we basically create templates, documentation templates for the different types of documentation that you could actually be working towards. And it's an open source project, so you can simply go over this template and then improve your documentation while you're trying to create a new documentation or upgrade your documentation standards. So basically, after we've created these templates, we gather the team together and everybody looks at the documentation and we get the opinions from different persons. What do you think about this? If you're a user, what would you think about this kind of templates? And that is what focus testing is all about. You get to hear the opinions of other persons beyond in a discussion kind of setting, and then you know which areas that need improvement and which areas that are good to go. Another test that you can also consider is the written questionnaire technique. So this is the technique where you create written questionnaires and have a certain group of readers also fill out a form and evaluate their comprehension about your document. So you could share a particular document to a certain group of users, which also could be internal members of a team or users that have actually gone through that document, only to hear their thoughts about that particular document, how much they understand it. So they fill in this form, you take it later and then interpret the data. Another test you can also look at is for usability testing is the one-on-one interview. So now in this technique, you request calls with individual contributors or individual experts and hear the opinions of each person. And you can ask the reader the questions about the document and see if he or she understands it. And with this method, you can actually get more reliable feedback from one person at a time, which will help you understand which aspect or area. And then you could do this based on the user personas. So you could do it based on an expert level and a beginner level. So you understand how an expert feels about your documentation and how a beginner feels about your documentation. But whichever test that you choose to go with, each test is aimed towards giving you the data that you need to understand your documentation and evaluate its usability. And by the time you're done with this test, you can move on to interpreting the data and then recording it and then implementing the recommendations, implementing the recommendations from each of these persons that you must have interviewed. After implementing it, you can go on ahead again to test it one more time to measure how effective the documentation has improved since the last time that you went through this test or the last time that you reviewed that particular documentation. Now, this way you can actually understand how the users feel about your documentation, how the engineers feel about your documentation, and how a beginner in the field actually feels about your documentation. Now, this feedback will help you improve on the experience from these different user personas and generally improve on the usability of that particular documentation. Now, after this is done, another angle to also look at is your role as a technical writer in the usability evaluation. Now, as technical writers, there's so many things that you could actually take into consideration, but some of the things to consider when evaluating the usability of a document as a technical writer is first, your understanding of the product. Since the technical writers are invariably or can be considered as first users of a product or a documentation, then since they're the first users of a documentation, they can actually help create more high quality content about that particular documentation. And another thing is the minimalist writing. So the documentation should also be in the simplest form as possible. And this means that you should consider writing less text and more graphics and relate content in plain text and script so that the users can also interpret it in the most easy ways possible. And you should also consider objective writing. This simply means that you shouldn't be biased with your content writing as a technical writer. You should write from the different angle, not as a creator of the project or as a user of the project. This way you have like a more genuine explanation of the product in a way that each of these individuals can also benefit from your documentation that you've written as a technical writer. And also you should look at the target audience. And so understand that the product and the target audience should align. So is it going to be too technical, or should it be too explanatory for the beginners, or should it be mostly for engineers or people who are experts in the field? All of these are things that you should also look at. And finally, to carry out this evaluation, you should create a detailed plan for your tests. Create a detailed plan that you can work with to your team, and curate all of the data properly so that you can use it in improving the experiences as you continue to create your documentation. And then one more thing to look at is why you should consider evaluating your documentation. First and foremost, for a product reliability. And the documentation plays a huge role in onboarding teams and users onto your product. And so the level to which a user can actually benefit from your documentation helps to determine how reliable they consider your product to be. Take, for instance, I use a documentation today and I come across an error, and then the documentation does not provide a solution for that error. I will most likely give a bad experience or report a bad experience at the end of the day. And that might affect not just one user, but other users that are also coming to use that documentation. So the product reliability is a thing to look out for. And then the user experience, you actually evaluate your documentation to be sure that a reader can quickly accomplish their goal on when coming to your documentation, and you can confirm that your documentation can help a less informed audience to adopt your product. And all of these are things that should actually prompt you to consider evaluating your documentation's usability. And I would like to end this section by saying that an accurate technical documentation does not equal a helpful technical documentation. And so you should bear in mind that if a user does not find the documentation usable enough, they will move on to the next project that has a better documentation and answers the solutions that they're looking out for. So thank you. And that is all for my section. If you have any questions now, I'll take those. And you can also reach out to me after now using my social media platform, Twitter or LinkedIn, whichever one. And you can also check out my portfolio down here at anitaihuman.dev.
Una empresa internacional de ingeniería proveedora de servicios de desarrollo de software avanzado. 10 años potenciando el ingenio de personas y empresas tecnológicas globales. Ihuman, 10 años haciendo real la robótica, desde LATAM hacia el mundo.
Bueno, bienvenidos a este track UX y gracias a Anita por su charla. Vamos a hacer la sección de Q&A con Anita, que está acá presente de forma remota, y gracias a ustedes por estar de ese lado. Les recuerdo, hagan sus preguntas en la sección de preguntas del chat de Swapcard, así le podemos hacer llegar las mismas a Anita. Así que bien. Anita, thank you for being here and your amazing talk.
Thank you everyone.
Yeah, you know, I feel really identified with the whole documentation mayhem, as having written a lot of documentation for projects and nobody reading them, so I can feel the pain. One of the questions we have around this is, you know, you mentioned a lot, like how to, a lot about how to address, you know, a project. I want to document this thing, and these are the things I need to follow. But like, what happens? You know, I have existing documentation for my existing projects. How do, like, what's a good approach for examining that documentation, making sure it's usable, kind of like monitoring the usability of my documentation for my existing projects?
Okay, well, when it comes to knowing how to effectively document a project, something I recently learned from Write Docs project is whatever documentation you're writing, it should be able to answer the question, what, when, where, who the project is for, and then how the participants get involved in this project. So if your project documentation answers these 5 questions, who it is for, what the project is all about, how the participants can also get involved with this project, and then why the project exists in the first place, I think that would be a good place to get started. And you can do this by reaching out to the technical writers in charge of this, because I'm sure someone who is experienced with writing should have an idea of this. So this will give you a good head start.
All right, that's great. So how often should we, like Edgar is asking, how often should we kind of like revise our technical documentation? Maybe like in the context we just were talking about, like I have these projects already documented, but how often should I revise them, right?
Well, the revision of your technical documentation should actually go hand in hand with the number of the frequency of the release that that project has. Let's say you drop a new release for that particular document, then the documentation should follow suit immediately, because a lot of times you see people want to update or integrate a project, but then the documentation is outdated because there has been like a new release and it's not been updated. So like once a new product release has been dropped, the documentation should follow suit and be updated immediately. So for some persons, you see teams releasing new product like every 3 months. So if that is the case, then you should also go as far as reviewing it as well. But other minor fixes and minor updates can be done like on a regular basis. As long as there is something to fix in that particular repository, then you can always go ahead to do that.
That's great. Cool. So, and there's like the mandatory question around this, right? And I know it's not a tools problem, but usually like, okay, what tool could we use, or would you recommend kind of like for making sure we are doing this the correct way, right? So do we need a management system to make sure we are doing it correctly? Do we need a CMS? Do we need like, you know, some people say, let's document Confluence, but people hate Confluence or Jira, or they don't, right? It depends, and then some people have different choices of tools. So what would you recommend?
Okay, for making sure that your documentation is up to date. So the Write the Docs project actually develops like templates to help implementing, or to help teams that are struggling with their documentation to better improve their documentation. So we have templates for how-to documentation, installation guides, and setting up, getting started. There are different templates here because there are different parts of documentation that exist. Okay. So with this template, it makes it a lot easier for your team to just pick it up and implement it with ease. And so probably you should also try checking out Write the Docs, because I think personally I always prefer the landing pages and the templates, because the templates on there, because these are developed by experts in writing skills. Yeah. And so it will be a lot easier for your team, especially if it's an upcoming project or a team that is still implementing its documentation.
Okay. All right. Thanks. And last one, short. Is documentation a part of the development process, the UX design process, or both included?
Documentation should be part of the planning, the implementation, and the execution. Because if you leave documentation for the ending aspect of the project, so many things that could be curated from the initial phase of the project will be missed out. And of course, if you get a new technical writer on the team at that time, they might not be able to capture all of these, because you might just use the word of mouth to explain it, but it wouldn't be as in-depth as it should be. And so from the project, from the moment when the project is being initiated, the documentation or the technical writers should be also included in the planning phase, so that they know how to write what not, and how to also make any changes if need be.
All right. Well, Anita, thank you so much for being there, for answering our questions and giving this amazing talk. Gracias a todos ustedes viéndonos de ese lado. Vamos a un pequeñísimo corte y seguimos con más Nerdearla. Vamos a nerdear.